Welcome, and thank you for joining 2020 State of Science Report. Before we begin, please ensure you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Note that all audio connections are muted at this time, but we will be taking chat questions throughout today's conference. To submit a question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel. Enter your question in the message box provided and send. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I will turn the conference over to Andrea Copping. Please, go ahead.
Thanks so much. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. We are going to dive into some of the chapters on the stressors and receptors associated with marine renewable energy, which are portions of this 2020 State of the Science Report. And along with my co-editor, Lene Camry, we have just released this major volume last week. I just want to remind you a little bit before we get started that there is another webinar next week on the 22nd at the same time that will look at collision risk and environmental monitoring. The State of the Science Report is out on the streets, and it's considered a public draft. Looking for any comments you might have on by August 10th, and there's the download site, so if you go to tethys.pnnl.gov, you'll find it very easily, and we will release the final report in September. This report is a product of the Ocean Energy Systems Environmental Task under Ocean Energy Systems, which is a group of nations interested in marine energy, and the 15 nations that have come together for OES-Environmental are the ones that have overseen, put together, and in many cases authored chapters in this volume. So today's presentation, we have a jam-packed schedule I think you're going to find really interesting. First, we will be talking about underwater noise, and Dr. Chris Bassett and Dr. Brian Pelagic from the University of Washington will cover that. Following that, Dr. Andrew Gill from CFAS in Wales will be talking about electromagnetic field effects. Next, Dr. Lene Camry from Pacific Northwest National Lab will be looking at effects of changes in habitats from marine renewables. Jonathan Whiting from PNNL will talk about changes in oceanographic systems. And the final presentation will be Dr. Lisel Garavelli from PNNL talking about the potential for animals to become entangled in moorings. So what I'm going to do is turn this over to Brian and Chris in just a moment. I do want to remind you that we will be taking questions down the chat box on the lower right, probably, of your screen, as the operator mentioned. And we will take a small number of questions after each of these presentations, and then we'll reserve time at the end for more questions, but feel free to post them at any time. Okay, with that, I would like to turn the presentation over to Chris Bassett.
All right, it looks like I have it, and I'm ready to go. As Andrea said, I am Chris Bassett, and I'm going to be doing this presentation today with Brian Pelagic, and we are going to be discussing the risks to marine animals from underwater noise generated by marine energy converters. And, of course, there's a lot of information, a lot of details that we don't have time to get to here today, so we're going to do a brief overview of what is contained in the chapter, and hopefully you will visit it for additional details. All right, going forward, the relevance to marine renewable energy of underwater sound relates to biological functions of marine life. So many different marine animals, be they marine mammals or fishes, use sound much like we do here on land. Those sounds can be used for social behaviors or for foraging. And so the way this relates, of course, to marine energy is that if we are introducing a new source of sound to the underwater environment, there are concerns, of course, that could in some way interfere with important biological functions and have consequences. Now, in order to actually understand and come to terms with the potential risk that's posed by noise from underwater devices, we actually have to wrap our heads around a number of different variables, all of which are fairly complex. So beginning with the device noise, as you can imagine, a device will produce different amounts of noise in general at different times, whether it's operating or static, etc. And likewise, we can expect that different devices operating in different locations, etc., will have unique acoustic signatures. That is, the amount of sound radiated at a particular frequency and the intensity of that sound will be different. So in order to start wrapping our head around this, we have to keep in mind what an individual device's signature is going to look like. And that's typically done through measurements. The next key variable in this problem is sound propagation. So after that noise is generated by the device, propagates out into the environment where it decreases in intensity as it propagates away. And in complex three-dimensional environments, shallow coastal environments, getting a handle on this propagation is perhaps a little bit of a challenge, but not the biggest issue for us right now. It's just an important variable I want to bring up. Now, next, we need to be concerned about ambient noise. We're all familiar with this. That's the sound of the environment around us. In a marine environment, if a device is producing noise, but it cannot be heard because it is being masked by ambient noise, then it's unlikely to have any biological consequences because it can't be detected. And this brings us to the final variable, of course, which is hearing sensitivity. The ability of any animal to detect and respond to a sound is going to be limited by its capacity to hear in general. So in order to look at the consequences, potential consequences of device noise, we need to consider all of these things. The rest of what I'm going to focus on today is going to be the device noise component of all of these variables. So, revisiting the 2016 State of the Science report and where things were at, it was noted that acoustic injuries to animals are unlikely. The reason being that these to cause an acoustic injury requires radiated noise with quite high intensities, and the idea was that operational marine energy converters were unlikely to produce sound of that intensity unless certain methods were used during the construction phase, like pile driving, which is known to be a higher intensity noise source. So, again, acoustic injuries were considered unlikely. However, it was noted that acoustic disturbance of animals is possible. The idea here was that noise from devices could be audible to some marine animals. Now, with that being said, there's pretty broad uncertainty regarding hearing sensitivities and the ability of animals to actually hear this noise. Second, we had a very limited understanding of radiated noise from marine energy converters at the time. And then finally, the link between underwater noise and animal response to said noise is actually quite difficult to establish. And a number of other industries have looked at this. They're industries that are much larger, more developed than marine energy. And these are issues that they struggle with as well. So this is a challenging topic to study. And then finally, I think it's pointed out that there were no international standards for measuring device noise, and the challenge of that is sort of every set of measurements is slightly different, and it can be difficult to compare them. So that's where we were in 2016. Looking at now what we have to work with now in 2020, what I'm going to do is step through a few slides and highlight some of the new studies that have come out. I can't go into details, but these are all described in at least a couple of paragraphs in the new report. So first, looking at tidal turbines, there were 3 new studies that came out. All 3 looked at different devices under different sets of operating conditions. And one thing that was great about these studies is that all of these were measured using drifting hydrophones. Brian is going to talk about standards development later, but this method is now recognized as sort of the best way to obtain quality measurements in tidal environment, so it's good to see that methodology being adopted. In these studies, only one attempted to predict the audibility of radiated noise of devices, and that was looking at marine mammals in particular. The other two papers just looked at the actual noise signature of those devices. What we saw from this, or these studies, were that radiated noise from these devices were primarily limited at frequencies below 20 kilohertz, although more common were much lower frequency noises. And that, of course, these devices, the amount of noise that they produced was related to the operational state of the device, although we can't more broadly generalize the trends that were observed there. A continuing problem, or I should say challenge, in some of these environments is distinguishing between ambient noise and noise produced by devices. And this is, again, something that hopefully new standards development, et cetera, is going to help deal with going forward. Sorry, just trying to advance here. All right. Also sticking with the topic of turbines, but actually looking at behavioral responses, there were 4 different studies that considered these issues in particular. We had a mesocosm study using simulated playback of tidal turbine noise to look at behavioral responses of fishes, and then 2 at-sea playbacks using noise to look at marine mammal responses. And then a final study by Pine et al. Basically combined a lot of data sets to look at the listening space reduction for marine mammals. And in this context, listening space is really the area over which they can hear. And the idea in this study was that if there was a reduction in their listening space due to the turbines, that was equated to a behavioral response. And that's an extremely conservative way to try to get at the idea of behavioral responses by marine animals. So what was learned from these 4 studies was that, first of all, behavioral responses to playback, keyword being playbacks of noise, have been observed. The audibility of sound to an animal is necessary but not sufficient to elicit a behavioral response, and that is, of course, a challenge here. In addition to that, one thing that's been noted is that responses may have seasonal variability, and habituation may occur. So this points to the general need for long-term studies to really try to get at these issues. In these studies, no changes in the use of space over broader areas were observed as a consequence of the playbacks. And then to date, we really still don't have enough information to evaluate animal behavioral responses in dose response framework. I believe Brian is going to touch on this very briefly later. 2 more things, and then I'm going to pass things over to Brian. We have wave energy measurements, 2 that came out in the past 4 years. In both cases, these were field measurements of Fred Olson Lifesaver using a fixed platform. So done in Hawaii and the UK, and the good news is that there were consistent outcomes from both of these 2 deployments. Again, that's great since they're the same device, different location. What was observed in these cases was that, as with prior studies, relatively low intensity noise, primarily concentrated below 1 kilohertz, was observed. And finally, actually at the wet site, the test infrastructure actually played a really important role in the observed noise and was higher in amplitude than the wave energy converter noise. So this is something that should just be considered both in site design, but also in measurements of this, that it's not just the device that matters, but the other infrastructure at the site. So for further details on all this, please see our report. And at this point, I am going to make an attempt to hand the ball off to Brian to continue talking about our work. Brian, I think you've got it.
I have the ball. Thank you, Chris. So one of the developments since 2016 has been the adoption of a consensus technical specification that describes how to characterize the acoustic emissions from marine energy converters. And this was done by the same group that's developed standards for things like power performance, resource assessment, design loads for marine energy. This specification, 62600-40 in IEC speak, is the first one that's really tried to get a handle on how to standardize the measurement of an environmental effect. And this is, I think, an important progression in how we try to characterize and understand the environmental effects of marine energy conversion. So this lays out a standard specification for measuring sound from wave energy converters, current turbines, rivers, oceans, and tidal, as well as ocean thermal energy conversion system. Lays out requirements for the acoustic measurement instrumentation, the hydrophones that are used, how those should be deployed, whether they should be deployed on a fixed platform or a drifting platform, depending on the type of characterization done, how to analyze the data and accept or reject data as valid, and how to report it back in a consistent manner. The standard lays out two levels of effort, level A and level B. In retrospect, we realize this is a little confusing because there's, under U.S. MMPA regulations, there's a level A and level B take. This doesn't have anything to do with it. It's just different levels of effort. Level B characterization is a relatively limited duration and scope. It's basically intended to do almost like a reconnaissance style survey of acoustic emissions. Level A is more comprehensive in duration and scope and attempting to tease out questions like how does device sound change in time and with operating state, as well as with respect to orientation relative to the marine energy converter. Now, the one thing that the specification does not do, if I can, there we go, is it does not address the behavioral consequences of the sound from marine mammals. This is basically developing consistent input into those discussions with regulatory agencies and investigations in the biological community. Okay, that's basically what's been done since 2016. The question is, well, really what gaps are left now? So I want to highlight three here, and Chris has already touched on this one of being able to distinguish marine energy converter sound from ambient noise. Things like the IEC standard help us try to do characterization in a consistent manner, but it doesn't tell us how to attribute sources to attribute sound to a particular source. And we experienced this firsthand at the wave energy test site when we were doing characterizations of a wave energy converter there. There was a warbling sound that we routinely detected. It was periodic with the waves. An inspection turned up metal shavings near one of the power takeoff units, and we attributed it to a bad bearing on the wave energy converter. And we were firmly convinced of this for almost 6 months. And then when the wave energy converter came out of the water, sound persisted, and it turned out to actually be a component of the mooring system. So that's a continued gap that we face, that attribution step. The second is that we haven't made a lot of progress on modeling radiated noise from arrays with high fidelity. And on one hand, that's okay because we don't have a lot of arrays in the water with which to validate any sort of array model. But as we move forward and think about State of the Science 2024, one of the challenges to trying to model radiated noise from arrays is that acoustic propagation models often require information about the water properties and the sediments that aren't necessarily available. Things like how the sound speed profile is changing in 3 dimensions in time, or how sound propagates through sediments to a depth of, say, 100 meters below the seabed. We often don't even know the composition of the sediment to that depth. And the third gap is this question of how to predict marine animal response to noise. Clearly, amplitude and frequency of sound really matter, but it's difficult to attribute the animal response to an acoustic stimulus, unless you're talking about it. Even when you're talking about a playback, there's a question of, is the animal responding to the presence of the playback vessel or the sound itself? When an actual marine energy converter is in the water, that attribution of behavioral response becomes increasingly difficult. So a couple of things to try to close these gaps. First, we really recommend that to the extent possible, people start to employ this international consensus standard to characterize radiated noise. This should give us a much better apples-to-apples comparison across multiple types of marine energy converters, and that should help us start to develop some generalized guidance about the expected type of emissions, how they vary in space, and how they should vary in time. We definitely do want to see people developing methods for source attribution. This is something that's not discussed in the standard because at the time it was published, there wasn't a consensus of how to do this. There's a number of projects that are underway now, and some of those are showing real promise to trying to tie acoustic emissions back to a source much more accurately than we can today. So if you use the standard, please provide feedback to the IEC working group. It's ad hoc group 11. Chris is involved in that. Happy to take feedback back to that group for discussions as that specification evolves over time. And the second thing we want to point out is that when it comes to looking at animal response, behavioral studies using playback seem to provide some pretty useful data. We do want to make sure that when we do these playbacks that the sound that is produced actually matches the sound we expect from marine energy converters. And using standards to actually populate these playback studies, if you will, is a great way to do that. We also want to make sure that we're taking measurements of the received levels at animal location, or we have a good way of estimating it accurately so we can start to put together dose-response metrics. That's something that would be a really valuable and useful tool to understand the biological implications. And then finally, these studies to date have mostly been run for short term. There's an indication that these are going to need to be run for longer term periods for two reasons. One is we want to be able to tease out the difference between seasonal variation in sound and habituation to sound. But the other challenge is that if we're trying to understand the effects on infrequently occurring species, then longer term observations are going to be required to actually build that knowledge base. And in a sense there, using playbacks is easier than using actual devices. It's a lot easier to keep a playback system in service for over a multi-year period than it is necessarily to keep a prototype marine energy converter in service for the same period. So with that, thank you for listening to the discussion of underwater noise, and we're happy to take a couple of questions.
Thanks so much, Chris and Brian. That was fantastic. Okay, we do have some questions. We're running a little slow, so let's just knock off a couple of quick ones here. Chris, do you want to just verify whether drifting hydrophones are now considered the standard approach for net measuring noise through near tidal turbines?
Yes, so I saw that question. Thanks for the question. It's a good one. The answer to that is yes. The specification Brian was just talking about includes additional information about that. This is summarized a little bit in the report as well, but due to the impact of flow noise that is in strong tidal currents, non-acoustic noise that gets picked up by hydrophones that interferes with radiated noise signatures, we now recognize that drifting measurements in these high energy tidal environments is critical to getting a good measurement. So yeah, for tidal turbines, drifting measurements is absolutely what is recognized as best practice now, and that's reflected in the literature that's coming out about devices. Brian, do you have any further comments on that?
I would just say that fixed measurements are allowable if they can demonstrate that they have dealt with the low frequency flow noise contamination appropriately. And that gets into two other questions here on frequency of sound. And the IEC specification by default says that you should characterize sound between 10 hertz and 100 kilohertz. It's a pretty broadband response. It doesn't get all marine mammal hearing in that range. That's a default range. At the upper end, you can extend that in the event that a regulatory agency says that they want to look at a higher frequency. There's nothing stopping you from going higher. You are allowed to go to a lower high frequency limit if you can demonstrate through reconnaissance that the acoustic emissions from the device don't really exceed ambient above a certain frequency. That can be helpful if you're doing a long-term fixed recording. And at the low end, that 10 hertz is the default. You can increase that a little bit if you're in water shallow enough that sound won't really propagate. But one of the things that Chris mentioned in terms of the challenges at low frequency is flow noise. Trying to keep that out of the record in tidal current measurements. It's also a challenge at wave energy sites. Wave orbitals during big waves do produce flow noise on fixed measurements at the seabed. And the standard does go into significant detail about how to try to detect and identify flow noise, how to mitigate it. And it's one of the open areas specification is how to do a better job mitigating that so we actually can get a reasonably high fidelity measurement at those lower frequencies.
That's fantastic. Thanks. I think we're going to hold a couple of other questions for later and move on. Thank you so much, Brian and Chris. Brian, could you pass the ball over to Andrew Gill, please? Thanks. That was great. Now, our next speaker is Andrew Gill with CFAS in Wales, who has been looking at effects of electromagnetic fields on marine animals for a bit. So please, Andrew.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody from the UK. Yes, I'm presenting on behalf of myself and my colleague Marika Defender, and we are actually at the at CFAS, which is actually in England, but we're all linked together. And CFAS provide expertise and advice to UK governments on marine and freshwater science. So in this particular presentation, what we'd like to do is cover the topic of electromagnetic fields, which has links to the noise element because it is energy emission that goes into the water related to energy production, particularly related to the power generation, electricity transmission, and the majority of information that we have of this does not come from marine renewable energy, unfortunately, because there's been very little studies done on this. A lot of it comes from the offshore wind sector. So I'll be using that as an example to try and illustrate the state of the science for this. So generally, overview of electromagnetic fields themselves in relation to marine energy. Brief overview from the last State of Science report, and focusing on the current knowledge status, and then thinking about separating out effects and impacts, because this is important because some of these environmental effects are creating potential barriers to deploying devices, and it's the scale of the deployment which is important, you'll see at the end, and then just covering some knowledge gaps and recommendations. So just very briefly, and this is a summary of the report, so the text in the report just cover this in more detail, and there's also a number of other documents which illustrate this in more detail. But basically, this diagram is showing you that we have a natural electromagnetic environment, which is throughout the world coming from the Earth's magnetic field, geomagnetic field, and the image on the left is just showing you the isolines relating to the magnetic field across the world. So essentially, we have a natural EMF environment. We also bathe from the outside. The second diagram illustrates the B and the E relates to B as magnetic field is electric field. So the electromagnetic environment is an interaction between electric magnetic fields. That's found by Michael Faraday back in 1800s. And so we have many sources of this. As you can see, it can come from space, it can come from centrally from the Earth's core, it can come from lightning, the atmosphere, and at the top of the diagram on the right, we've got human interactions such as cabling, onshore electrical grids, power stations, rail networks, etc. So there are lots of potential sources of this that are either natural or are associated with other human activities, and they pervade the environment. It's a very strange thing for humans to think about, but they do pervade the environment that organisms are in. Like I said, I'm using offshore wind as the example of why the question of EMF has come up, because people will say that there are cables in the environment and they've been there for 100, 150 years. Yes, they have, but the scale of interest in cabling related to offshore energy, marine energy, is really quite important. And so the question has been raised from the offshore wind sector. Here's an example from Europe, which is either the existing or planned offshore developments. And essentially, all those developments in the sea have got cables which come to shore. And it's the cabling which is important. And whether the cables are attached to a wind turbine, a tidal turbine, or a wave device, actually, for this topic area, that doesn't really matter. It's how much power is generated and the characteristics of the cable itself and the organisms that are in that environment. So just to sort of contextualize that, and again, this is a difficult topic to get your head around sometimes, so really we're talking about, here is a composite diagram showing a variety of different energy devices, some of them on the seabed, like the shrouded tidal devices, wave devices, and essentially we've got the red lines are sort of perceived emissions from the cables coming from the different devices, and then collected together, sometimes at a substation or multiple cables, and usually the thickness of the line here shows an increase in the size of the cable, so that's the increase in power. So often we have a bigger export cable to shore. So the EMF environment is predicted to be there. We can use models, electromagnetic models, to illustrate that. Here are two images which are showing alternating current on the left-hand side and direct current on the right-hand side, both of which are in the environment. And essentially these different coloured curves are related to different cables, existing cables, either power cables or related to offshore energy devices. And all you want to look at is the zero in the middle is the cable axis, So imagine it coming out of the screen at you. And we have a peak over the cable axis, and it dissipates. And it depends on the type of cable you have and the setup, the way that dissipation occurs. And you can see we get double peaks, etc., etc. The key thing here is the AC on the left-hand side and DC on the right-hand side, and they differ in terms of the magnitude. DC fields tend to be probably about an order of magnitude greater. In terms of the organisms themselves, they are utilized, magnetic fields, electric fields have been utilized since organisms first inhabited the Earth. So we have bacteria that orientates to magnetic fields, marine mammals that navigate by moving around the Earth according to magnetic stimuli. And on the bottom we have migratory species of fish. We have invertebrates that move around that have been suggested to follow magnetic cues. And on the right-hand side, we have the elasmobranchs, which are the sort of the key organisms in the environment that utilize both magnetic and electric fields. Now, where it's important when we're thinking about the organisms is in relation to the scale. So those organisms that were the migratory ones tend to use these stimuli over greater distances, so they're moving around large areas. And so if we're putting cables and devices in the water which are emitting the fields, then the question comes up, is that going to create some kind of barrier at the worst extent or some kind of stimulus that they'll respond to as they're moving around their environment? This also comes down to fine scale, where we've got particularly electroreceptive organisms where they are actually using fine scale localized fields for finding things like food, for finding mates, and for local orientation. So there are differences in scale which are important, which is why the dissipation of the field and the power in the cables is really important. The other context is thinking about the drivers behind why we should be interested in this. It's a strange topic area that humans have real problems trying to get their heads around, but essentially they are in the environment, and there is an acceptance that they may cause in air potential human health issues. So I'm using European legislation as an example here, but there is a recognition that electric cable environments, there are thresholds, there are standards, but that's all related to human health. In relation to the aquatic environment, there's no standards, no specific legislation or policy that's known. What is utilized when it comes to the cables is the consideration of the cable routing and things like the physical disturbance, but not the actual EMF. And then you've got EMF and heating, which is a potential outcome of the power generation and movement of electricity through cables. The reasons why we need to be looking at this is that actually there is a number of elements within our marine environmental legislation which may require us to, and there's a couple of examples at the bottom here, again from a European perspective, because this is where the questions have been raised initially. But when we're talking about trying to protect biodiversity, trying to look after species which we have designation, then actually there's a requirement to look at potential stressors. And for instance, in Europe, we have a thing called the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is where a lot of the noise legislation and requirements for noise monitoring come in, but actually it's about energy inputs. And as you can see, electromagnetic fields are one of those things. So there is a requirement to consider it. Okay. So the context we have is here's some diagrams looking at an AC and a DC cable, just to try and sort of convey the complexity. We have the red line is the cables, and you can see we've got an emission in the blue circles coming off the cable, which is essentially the magnetic field caused by the movement of electricity. Electric fields that are directly generated tend to be maintained within the cable because of protective sheathing, but the magnetic field isn't. It's a magnetic field going into the marine environment particularly, which is where we get the link between electric and magnetic fields, because in a saline environment and a moving environment where the water's moving, or if the magnetic field itself is moving, such as on the right-hand side of an AC current, you get induced electric fields in the environment. So we have magnetic fields, we have induced electric fields, and they can be induced by animals swimming through the field or by the movement of water, like I said. And then also, in the sort of right-hand side of each of these diagrams, you can see that each of the organisms themselves have their own natural bioelectric field. As you do, sitting where you are, you have your own natural bioelectric field. So we have a number of sources, and there's a number of potential changes that may occur to the environment in relation to our generation of anthropogenic EMF. So the 2016 State of the Science report, basically, in overview, The EMFs have been studied either as magnetic or electric fields, and sometimes interaction, but generally the focus on magnetic fields. We're looking at ranges of studies from sort of 50 microtesla, and just for reference, the Earth's magnetic field is somewhere between 30 and 60 microtesla, up to millitesla. So any studies that have been done have looked at higher levels of the fields. In terms of electric fields, the few studies that have been done have been in a similar range to bioelectric fields that attract sensitive species. We know from the little information that we've got that we get greater fields with larger power cables. That's a basic physics principle. And modelling EMF does appear to be appropriate, but there's been very little validation apparent. So, are the models actually telling us the truth? That appears we can predict things. And then the conclusion was no current evidence to show that any issue exists, albeit on a very limited evidence base, in relation to marine hydrokinetic devices. And that's basically around the fact that they are relatively small power generation units. There were some suggestions from some studies, which are mainly sort of lab studies that are done in controlled circumstances, or some field studies looking at behaviorally or developmental physiological approaches, but with no consequences, and tended to be linked to higher EMFs. So the State of Science report sort of recommended that we should think about characterizing the EMF. So I'm looking at comparisons between AC and DC systems, looking at single and multiple cables, because it's all about how the cables are oriented in the Earth's magnetic field. So essentially the ambient field can actually add or subtract the field coming from the cable. We need to measure the actual levels. What is it that the animals are actually encountering, similar to the noise studies. Those response studies were way behind the curve on that, really, but we've got information on sort of potential lower thresholds and higher, but really we need to get better understanding of the responses related to different fields, and we need to look at tools to develop which combine models, EMF modeling with those response studies. And then thinking about actual research and monitoring to assess the encountering of the field multiple times might be something that is of more relevance to any potential issue in the future. So, to date, where are we at now? So the report that has been released just last week, we've got some very useful up-to-date reviews on the concept of magnetoreception, electroreception, perception of fields from anthropogenic origin, impacts from subsea cables. So there's some really good information that we've got that we can utilize, based a lot of it on experimental or laboratory evidence, which is used in the context of EMF in the environment. There's been some new research to add to the evidence base. I just want to give you a quick example. So here's a summary of some of the studies since 2016. And all I want you to look at is we've got, in the blue here, we've got field studies. Some of the studies showing an effect, yes, in terms of a response by a sensitive organism. Some of them showing contrasting results. Some showing, yes, there's an effect, or no, there doesn't appear to be one. That might be down to power generation, the size of the field coming from the cables. It might be down to statistical significance, numbers of replicates, etc. Changes in abundance along routes has been used to look at, and yes or no, there's some effect being demonstrated. And then towards the bottom, we've got more studies that have continued looking at laboratory studies, very focused on some of the sort of more physiological developmental aspects. And they tended to be looking at things like earlier life stages where there might be potential for influence of EMF. And that covers both AC and DC fields. Okay. So in terms of measuring in the field, there's a table in the report which actually shows that we've got a small number of studies have started to make some measurements. And again, all I want you to look at is the red area is we've got microtesla levels above the sea floor. It's in the range that animals are known to detect. They are in the range of the Earth's magnetic field as well. The electric field, again, in the sort of range of detectability. And also the extent of the EMF, it's ranging from the cable center to up to 10, in some cases up to nearly 100 meters. So an example of how we can try and understand this in a context, we need to work together with people who understand the devices, the power generation, and understand what's coming from the cable. And here's an example of a project that we were involved in where essentially you've got a cable which is this is a power cable feeding Long Island. We looked at a bespoke device measuring both the electromagnetic field. We looked at the power system because the variability in the field is going to be important to understand the potential response, and then a study looking at animal response to that cable itself as well. And just to summarize, here you can see measurements showing that the field is there, which matches quite well with the models. Interestingly, this cable we looked at had transformer stations at either end, and what we found is that there was actually an AC component to a DC cable, demonstrating the importance of actually measuring these things in the environment. There is not necessarily the perfect requirement that models have. There is the reality in the environment. In terms of the context of the animals, a very quick summary. Essentially, in terms of some of the variables that we looked at, we've got, this is a lobster, American lobster, a little skate. You see the ticks indicate a response in relation to being in the cable as opposed to a control that was away from the cable, and essentially a response with increasing EMF. Interestingly, the context is important. Whilst these animals responded to the cable, the question was, did they create a barrier to movement? And the answer to that is no, for the size of the cable that was used in this study. So it's important in the context of interpreting that. And this has been published and is available for download open access. So just to contextualize this to finish off, essentially what we need to do is look at defining the EMF. This is just a generalized framework. Define the EMF. Think about the receptors that we have. Are they fish? Are they invertebrates? Think about the scale that we're interested in. Are we interested in large-scale migration changes, or if they might be there? Are we interested in physiological early life stage histories? We need to understand likelihood of encounter to understand the cables and the emission extent, which is determined by the cables themselves and the power generation. And we need to look at how these link in, not just effects and responses, but how they link in with potential changes at a biologically relevant impact level. So future recommendations. So in the context of small single devices or even small arrays of marine renewable energy devices, there shouldn't really be any issue raised at the moment because these are small, there might be kilowatt devices. But we can work together to collect information on the EMF environment that's there to understand the context of it in different environments. So identify the sources and characterize that. Think about dose response studies. So how can we collect information that is going to help us understand when we get bigger fields with bigger devices and bigger arrays, that there may be some kind of response that we can determine that we might need to mitigate. We need to think about the animals that are going to interact with this are actually generally tend to be the more mobile species, so data collection for that has to be relevant. So things like tagging and tracking, understanding the potential encounter rate is not just the animals are there, that how often are they likely to encounter that cable. Thinking about longer-term studies as well to understand how many cables an animal might come across, and thinking about covariables because a cable just being there might have an attraction response for an animal and it might not be the EMF. We need to separate that in the studies. And then from all that, we can help determine impact. And in the noise presentation, you heard about standards. There hasn't been any discussion yet in terms of standards. We need to think about what measurements we have to get to understand the context properly before we start thinking about standards and sort of mitigation in a minute. We need more information on devices in the environment and the organisms that are likely to encounter them. Okay, so I'm going to finish off there, and thank you for your attention. There's a lot of information available, and very happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Andrew. That was fantastic. I think we're going to forego, well, here's one question. There are already wind farms in the hundreds of megawatt range, and the first gigawatt scale ones are under construction. There are international interconnectors in the gigawatt range. So why don't we know about larger cables and stronger fields? Is it simply a matter of waiting for the work to be done, or is there more to it? Why don't we know more?
I think it's actually, we don't know, but because it's not being asked of anybody to actually collect that information. Interestingly, there's a study came out about last month in the Netherlands where they actually were out collecting information on a wind farm with bigger cables. The issue is that, like any work at sea, is that we tend to collect this information when it's a nice, calm day, and therefore the power generation from wind turbines is very low. So we're not getting the power generation and the field measured at the highest state. but there is a move to actually bury things like magnetometers in the seabed to try and monitor things over different wind regimes. So it's just something that people haven't thought about at all, and they've kind of dismissed it as being something which is not of relevance or not as important, but it keeps coming up now, and there's now much greater requirement, particularly from the transmission operator people who are looking to try and understand, when they're putting more cables in the environment and bigger cables, how they might be changing. So it is on its way.
Great, thanks so much. So I think we need to move on. Andrew, if you could pass the ball over to Linnaig. Linnaig Hemery is our next speaker, and the topic is changes in habitat due to marine energy devices. Linnaig?
Sorry, I didn't unmute myself. Let's start again. Good morning and afternoon, everybody. So over the next 15 minutes, I will follow this outline to give you an overview of the Chapter 6 regarding changes in benthic and pelagic habitats caused by marine renewable energy devices. So as most of you must know, marine renewable energy devices must be attached to the seafloor, and so in that case, they interact with the benthic environment. They also often have mooring lines or transmission cables, also the devices themselves in the water column, either part or the entire water column. And in this case, they interact with the pelagic habitat. And so these physical changes have potential to disrupt or create habitats, and they can also alter the behavior of marine organisms. This is a concern that has been raised by regulators and stakeholders for many years, and it's fully acknowledged by the industry. However, the ability to detect changes is quite tricky and depends on several factors like natural variability or survey designs. The effects on habitats caused by marine renewable energy devices are not different from those of other industries like offshore wind or oil and gas platforms. And so we can use these surrogate industries to learn on these effects. In the 2016 report, the main findings regarding changes in habitats was that communities at MRE sites were not different from nearby reference sites, and they showed temporal variability comparable to natural processes. However, there was a concern about marine energy devices providing opportunities for non-native species to colonize those devices and potentially spread to natural environments. This chapter ended with some recommendations, like determining the effect of MRE devices using field data rather than surrogates, addressing effects of arrays on cumulative impact, developing a framework of ecosystem changes, validating models with field data, investigating the stepping stone hypothesis, especially for non-native species, and keeping on monitoring existing development sites. And as you will see through the next few slides, there's been some progress made along these lines, but most of these recommendations can still hold true as of 2020. So since 2016, we've seen more devices in the water, either wave or tidal energy devices. So they have allowed for more monitoring and research studies. However, most of these devices were for short-term deployment, like a few months to a year or two. So that still doesn't alleviate the reliance on surrogate industries. Since 2016, we've also seen 2 small arrays being deployed in Scotland, tidal arrays. However, there is no public results associated with changes in habitats for these 2 arrays. We've seen also more modeling approaches being used and published. So we're getting more information about long-term effects from these approaches. Now let's move on to the effect during the installation phase. So the first effect that we can have in mind is the loss of benthic habitat due to the installation itself of the device. This is usually a very small effect. If siting is done properly, it can be limited or mitigated. There is also issues during the installation phase with the cable. If the cable is laid on top of the sediment, like you can see on this picture, or if it's buried using trenching or digging techniques. And so the disturbance engendered by this installation is usually limited to a narrow path along the cables, usually a few meters on either side of the cable line, and results in suspended sediments and increased turbidity that will last for a few hours to a few days, depending on the local hydrodynamic. If the cables are laid on top of the sediment, we will see crushed organisms under the cable protection. But again, if siting is done properly, this should be limited. And some studies have started to look into increase in temperature at the cable interface with the sediment. The recovery after cable installation is usually site-specific. Studies have shown that it can take a couple of weeks to 6 years in a soft sediment habitat, and within 1 to 8 years on a hard substrate for the sediment to recover and the benthic communities to also recover. On cable protections, like you can see on this picture, can also provide some hard substrate habitat for nearby communities. Now let's move on to the operational phase. So one of the first effects that we can think of is the scarring effect or footprint effect. This is the removal of sediments around the footprint of a device due to the fast-flowing water and local turbulence around the base of the device. So this effect is not specific to MRE devices. It's been observed around all sorts of structure like tidal or wind turbine foundations, mooring anchors, other artificial structures like pier pilings. A couple of studies have recently measured this effect around tidal turbines and also mooring anchors, and they saw in the immediate vicinity coarser sediments than in the surrounding area, and an increased variability, in the epiphonia communities. However, this effect was limited to the area directly adjacent to the tidal turbine or the anchors, like in 20 to 50 meters away from the device. MRE devices and other artificial structures can also create new habitats, and especially for biofouling organisms. This is a natural process. It's mainly a concern for the design or engineering part of the devices. Fouling assemblages have been shown to vary a lot between locations and material. For example, concrete portions of the foundation will have different assemblages than a steel part of a foundation. And usually they are comprised of hard substrate colonizer. As you can see on the image on the right, there is barnacles, sponges, mussels. If the device spans a good portion of the water column, we can also observe vertical zonation, and we'll see successional stages over the months or years of deployment. Biofouling communities are strongly influenced by the natural variability and the presence of nearby rocky substrates or artificial structures that will provide larvae for recruitment. A concern with biofouling is the presence of non-native species on providing a support for dispersion. So non-native species are very common in harbors, especially where there is lots of traffic, and are moved by ballast water. However, there is no report so far of non-native species at MRE devices yet, and there have been a couple of reports of non-native species at cables, but the species were already seen in the natural environment before the cables were put in place. So this is something that regulators and developers have in mind, but there is no evidence yet of non-native species. A subsequent effect of biofouling is the artificial reef effect. This is when a device or any artificial structure attracts mobile organisms that come for food or shelter. This effect is common around offshore wind turbines, like you can see on this picture on the right, and is seen from the top to the bottom, with different communities along the way. It's also observed at non-bearing cables, like I showed you at the beginning, since the protection can provide some small rocky reef habitats. An indirect effect of this artificial reef effect is the increase in biomass and organic matter in the near vicinity of the seafloor. This is the enrichment of the benthos due to what we call the litter fall, or the fall of dead animals or feces from different levels of the device. It may take years to decades to be observed, and this is currently observed at offshore wind farms that have been in the water for many years. There hasn't been any MRE devices long enough in the water yet to observe such effects. However, models here can help us understand this effect. The few models that we have seen so far show a localized effect. Now, a subsequent effect of the artificial reef effect is the reserve effect. This is when MRE devices or offshore wind turbine here are in the water, are in place. There is often cables, mooring lines or cables on the bottom that cause a hazard for fishing activities. And so there is usually exclusion zones in place and the areas become de facto a reserve. Those reserves will then promote the recovery of local populations of like fish or decapods, which can sometimes overspill out of the area on benefit to the local fisheries. This effect is very common at offshore wind farms. We have still yet to see it at MRE devices areas because they have not been long enough in the water. Sometimes it's hard to assess this effect due to some illegal fishing that may still occur. And so like the artificial reef effect, it can take several years to decades to be observed. But here also models can help us understand this long-term effect. And so models are actually a very good complement to baseline characterization and monitoring surveys. They can especially help us address more empirical questions like the offshore wind, like the artificial reef or reserve effect. We can also look at large-scale dispersion, for example, of non-native species, also address effects like changes in species occurrence due to OES, like shown on the images on the bottom right, which look at the occurrence probability of a benthic species with changes in current velocity due to a potential tidal array. However, several of these models may require input data at high resolution that is still not yet available for a lot of the sites looked for MRE development. Now let's move on to some guidance on measuring changes in habitat. So to be able to detect changes after devices are in the water, it's really important to have good baseline data. It's also important to consider spatiotemporal natural variability. For example, you can see on this graph on the right that with those 5 decades of macroinfauna survey, they would have missed the spike in different species in over 5 years. However, I'm not saying that we should have 4 or 5 decades of baseline data at each proposed MRE site, but regulators and developers should be aware of the natural variability in benthic and pelagic habitats in the general area, and for that, look at what has already been surveyed in the area. We should also have well thought on adapted survey designs to be able to observe effects other than natural variability, and especially take into account a before and after design. On last guidance, it would be need to use models whenever possible or appropriate, especially if input data are at high resolutions are becoming more available. And so let's finish with some recommendations to move forward. So as I mentioned before, we really think it's important to define relevant spatiotemporal scales for the surveys to be able to detect any effect on changes in habitat. It's important to identify thresholds for changes in those habitats so we can know what to look for. It's nice to use also modeling approaches at a different stage of device deployment, for example, for siting using habitat characterization, habitat suitability models, or long-term effect models for looking at trophic levels or this kind of thing. We also recommend to characterize the biofouling of artificial reef communities to have a better idea of what are the non-native species to look for. Also to transfer the knowledge on lessons learned from surrogate industries as much as possible, especially offshore wind studies where a lot is being learned currently. And then identify cumulative effects of marine renewable energy devices with other activities. And so we recommend that several of these points be addressed by researchers at universities and government research institutes and shared with the broader ocean energy community to avoid draining the budget associated with permitting or consenting a specific MRE project. With that, so here are some of the references for your information that we used in the chapter, and the link where you can find the chapter. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Lene. That was great. And that reminds me, all of these slides and the audio will be recorded and posted later on up on TIFA, so you'll be able to look at the list of references and so on. So I think in the interest of time, we're going to move on. So, Lene, if you don't mind passing the ball to Jonathan. Our next speaker is Jonathan Whiting with Pacific Northwest National Lab, and John is going to talk about changes in environmental systems. So take it away, John.
Great. Thank you, Andrea. To this slide. All right. Well, before I begin, I'd like to thank all of you for tuning in, and I'd like to thank my co-author, Grace Chang from Integral Consulting. So today we're going to start with some basics about oceanographic systems and how they're measured, and then we're going to walk through some key findings from literature in the last 4 years, ending with some recommendations moving forward. So oceanographic systems encompass the physical, biological, and chemical systems of the marine environment. These are the effects of placing a new object in the ocean and collecting energy. The immediate effects can be changes in flow, removal of energy, or a reduction in wave height. And these tend to affect specific processes depending on the technology type and location. Tidal devices, which are often located in channels, affect the tidal range. By that I mean the heights of the water, basin flushing, water moving in and out of an estuary, and sediment and nutrient transport, among other things. One thing to note quickly is that tidal turbines have significantly less effect than dams or tidal barrages that will block the whole channel. So dams and tidal barrages were not included and are not really very comparable Wave energy converters will largely affect the mixing of temperature and naturally occurring temperature and salinity gradients, and they also control coastal erosion and formation. Now, the changes in oceanographic systems chapter is a continuation of the changes in physical systems chapter in the 2016 report. We changed the name because physical systems felt a little too limiting as not all the effects were physical. One key identification from the 2016 chapter is that risk is very low for small numbers of devices. Researchers can observe some changes immediately behind the devices, the wake field or turbulent field, but distant effects to oceanographic systems are usually very small for small numbers of devices, such that they cannot be seen over natural variability. So the key theme is preparing for future large commercial arrays, which is often done with modeling. Real quick. There were five issues remaining, 5 challenges remaining unanswered from the last report. The first is better validation of models. The second is targeted research around turbulence around devices. The third was better device designs incorporated within models. And the fourth was less distinction between far field and near field distance scales. And then lastly, that cumulative effects, you always need to recognize that there are other anthropogenic and natural changes also occurring in the same environment that should also be factored in. So before we dive into the recent studies, I wanted to cover some technologies for measuring changes in oceanographic systems. The first is acoustic Doppler technologies. Most common are current profilers, or ADCPs. You can see one pictured below hanging from a buoy about to be deployed downward facing. These send and receive sound signals at various frequencies, which allows the computation of water velocities based on sound travel time and frequency shifts. You can use multiple transducers to allow a 3D current to be calculated, and they can also measure particle concentrations such as sediment transport, plankton biomass, and schools of fish. The second technology is remote sensing, which provides measurements over large spatial areas. The most common is radar, which bounces light off surfaces and can measure currents, waves, and coastal morphology. LIDAR, one of the more common forms of radar, can be seen measuring waves in the image below. So we're going to walk through a couple key studies involving field measurements. Several studies took measurements in this first one at the European Marine Energy Centre, or EMF, which are some test sites in the Orkney Isles of northern Scotland, where they tested more devices than anywhere else in the world. The flowback device, which you can see below, was used to isolate turbulence from a tidal turbine from that of naturally occurring turbulence caused by seabed friction. A second study used the REDAP platform to measure wave and flow fields around deployments for several years, and they showed that there were site-specific differences between ebb and flow, which is tides moving in and out of a system, which has siting implications. In the second study, ORPC deployed a floating riverine turbine at Igugig, a remote village in Alaska. You can see the device pictured below. They measured similar turbulence with or without turbine operation, showing that turbulence was largely caused by the structure. The third study to highlight is from Carnegie, which is a major wave developer in Australia. They deployed several floating devices near Perth. You can see an image of one below. And they measured a decrease in wave height behind the devices that recovered quickly. They also paired their monitoring efforts with modeling and showed that the modeling did underestimate the wave reduction effects, and that they felt that this was likely due to low resolution boundary forcing in their model. Now, researchers also conduct tests in flumes and wave tanks to measure changes in a controlled system. The images below are examples of a flume and wave tank. We typically see decreased water velocity downstream of the turbine, and that can cause sediment deposition immediately behind the turbine. The velocity is actually increased along the sides of the turbine, and actually may see scour along the structure. There is generally a turbulence field behind the turbine that slowly recovers. Regarding wave converters, wave energy converters, we see most studies looking at either the reflection of waves off floating devices or a reduction in wave heights, and kind of measuring both of those changes. One significant finding across both wave and tidal tests was the importance of device spacing for a given location. It was found that there's optimal spacing for devices to maximize power while reducing environmental impact. And this tends to depend very much on the location and the device shape. Now, there were a lot of tidal energy models out there. The report focuses on models that are studying environmental concerns rather than power performance or resource characterization. I'm going to highlight a couple of studies with some interesting findings. The first is part of the Terawatt project, which is a consortium of research institutes that performed some extensive modeling and data collection in the Pentland Firth and Orkney waters in northern Scotland. And they made that data and calibration methods available to the public. The next study modeled some very small arrays, less than 2 megawatts, in Puget Sound in the United States. The results showed a very small impact on tidal circulation for such small arrays. The third study looked at various tidal energy extraction scenarios in Fontvieille Strait in France. They saw potentially observable changes to existing circulation patterns, and they saw displaced recirculation eddies. The last model, which took place in the UK, compared a large 3.8 gigawatt tidal extraction scenario with a high emissions 2050 climate change scenario. The plots below show some results from that. In panel A, you can see the results in terms of tidal range for just the tidal energy extraction scenario. Panel B shows with just climate change, and then C shows done cumulatively. And you can actually see that tidal extraction reduces the local water levels, which counteracts some sea level rise effects when combined cumulatively, so it negates the impact. That being said, not shown here, they also did show that both climate change and the extraction scenario reduced tidal velocities, which cumulatively, which reduces mixing in the system, though it was noted that climate change was an order of magnitude greater in that effect. There were also a lot of wave models, and again, we focused only on those studying environmental concerns. The first study modeled different configurations of a 12-device array off the west coast of Ireland. Like some earlier lab tests, this showed that configurations can be optimized to reduce environmental impact while maximizing power output. The second model was a 60-device array off Newport, Oregon in the United States with several different layouts and wave conditions. They showed that arrays closer to shore and more closely spaced can have greater environmental effects, especially as wave heights and periods increase. The last study was one of several to use wave energy converters for shoreline protection for eroding coastlines. The photo below are some examples of coastal flooding at sensitive beaches in southern Spain. The study showed that as few as 8 devices located close to shore and strategically sited can significantly reduce erosion. At the end of the chapter focused on 3 primary recommendations to address concerns around oceanographic systems. At this point in time, all deployments around the world are small enough that effects outside of the immediate lake field cannot be measured. Models are therefore important to predict changes from future larger arrays. And as these larger arrays are developed, it's important that far-field measurements be taken before and after because it's going to be necessary to make sure that modeling results are accurate. The main idea behind the second recommendation is that the marine environment is constantly changing. The ocean experiences annual seasons. There are multi-year patterns such as the North Atlantic Oscillation and El Nino Southern Oscillation, and there are extreme weather events such as hurricanes and winter storms. Meanwhile, humans are constantly using the ocean, adding new structures, dredging, shipping, oil and gas, and other offshore renewables, all this with the backdrop of long-term baseline shifts like climate change. So the effects of adding marine renewables should always be compared to these other activities. And studies should look at how oceanographic changes from marine renewables may cumulatively stack with these other changes, or how it may counteract, as we've seen in some studies. The last recommendation is in response to a trend with some modeling studies. Rather than simply describing the change caused by marine renewables, for example, you might say there was a decrease in flushing of 10%. Studies should instead describe the implications to the environment. For example, with that flushing example, that it may increase harmful algal blooms. It's always important to answer why these changes matter, how they affect specific organisms and ecosystems. Organisms can usually tolerate some change, but are the cumulative changes too much to handle, or are they causing population impacts? These are huge questions that vary based on location, device design, and the organism in question. So separate studies that explore these trends can provide valuable guidance to the interpretation of model results. And we believe make a good pairing. So we believe these to be the most fundamental recommendations to improve understanding of oceanographic changes and encourage researchers to focus on these research areas. And that is what I have for you. Thank you. There's some references.
Great, John, thanks so much. Okay, let's take one question here. Turbine rotors definitely do accelerate flow outside the rotor plane as a consequence of the velocity reduction in the rotor plane. Can you comment on the probability of this causing scour at tidal energy sites where the sediments tend to be relatively large, or deposition given that the sediments that fall out in the wake has to pass through the accelerated bypass region to be deposited? So really the interaction around tidal sites based on the sediment.
Yeah, I think it really does have to do with the location. In many cases, you are dealing with larger sediment or larger benthic, kind of hard rock within a channel, but there are definitely some locations around the world, especially, kind of the Pentland Firth area, where there are a lot of softer sediments that can move around and may scour or deposit. And so, generally speaking, that while that may be true, it kind of depends on the site and location.
Great. Okay, thanks so much, John. So we're going to move on to our last presentation by Lisel Garavelli, who is going to talk with us about the potential for large marine animals becoming entrapped or entangled in lines. John, if you want to pass the ball to Lisel.
There you go.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, as Andrea mentioned, my chapter was about the encounter of marine animals with marine renewable energy device mooring system and the subsea cables. And actually this topic, so the topic of marine animal encounter with MRE device mooring system and the associated risk of entanglement is an emerging topic among the potential environmental effects of marine renewable energy. So this chapter, if we compare to the other chapters, it's relatively small, and we have two main sections here, the summary of knowledge and the research and monitoring needs to resolve the issue. So why the entanglement of marine animals is relevant to marine renewable energy? Most marine renewable energy devices are attached to the seabed with mooring line or anchors to maintain their position in the water. And in the case of an array of marine renewable energy devices, we also have underwater drape cables. So we can see on the picture on the right here, this drape cable can be in between the devices, but also from the device to an onshore substation. So in the case, if we imagine a marine animal swimming in an area like that, there is the potential for this animal to encounter the mooring lines and cable, and there is also a potential for them to be entangled or entrapped. In this chapter, entanglement and entrapment are synonyms, and we define the entanglement as an event of a marine animal, as the event of a marine animal that may become caught in a system without the possibility of escaping. So if we want to understand better the risk of entanglement, we need to better understand the actual nature of this risk. And it's important to note here that the mitigation to avoid or reduce the entanglement risk for future MRE installation is yet to be determined. So the first thing we did when we started to work on this chapter was to look at what is the current research around entanglement of marine animals for marine renewable energy devices. And we found that the entanglement is currently not a significant issue of concern with its MRE consenting processes. However, as the scale of MRE development grows, this concern may become more considered by the regulatory bodies. Overall, in the studies that we looked into, we found little information and no observation of marine animals becoming entangled with marine renewable energy mooring lines or cable. And we found that the greatest concern of entanglement was mainly for large marine animals such as migratory whales, and there are some studies also that mention some concern of entanglement for seabirds, sea turtle, or large sharks. Here, even if the concern of entanglement exists, we don't really know what are the risks of injury or death from this entanglement. So as I mentioned, we don't know a lot about the entanglement of marine animals for marine, in the marine renewable energy industry. So what we did, we started to look at surrogate industry, and we found that the highest observation of entanglement is within the fishery industry, with most of the entanglement. So the entanglement are highly observed with fishing gear, such as nets, cables, and traps. And most of the entanglements that are observed with fishing gear are large marine animals that are entangled in loose end line or slack line. There are also observations of entanglement with elasmobranch and smaller marine animals, which are entangled in derelict fishing gear and marine debris. So a derelict fishing gear is an abandoned or discarded fishing gear, such as we can see here on the picture. And so it can be abandoned in the bottom of the water, as we can see here, but it can also drift in the water, a derelict fishing gear, and may be caught by another device. The other industry we looked into was the submarine telecommunication industry, and there is one study that describes the entanglement of whale in submarine telecommunication cable, but only prior to 1959. So these entanglements were observed in cables with excessive slack and in deep waters, and the authors say that no observation of this entanglement were occur after 1959, mainly because the design of the cable changed and they removed this excessive slack that was the main cause of entanglement. So if we want to compare these two surrogate industry with the marine renewable energy industry, we can look into the comparison between this net, this cable, and what would be the mooring lines or cable in the marine renewable industry. And in the marine renewable energy system, we know that the mooring lines are never sufficiently slack to create a loop. There is also no part that is going to be abandoned or discarded. However, we have a secondary entanglement that may be a concern here, which that's what I mentioned earlier. We may have a derelict fishing gear that is drifted and that may be caught by marine renewable energy device. But it's important to note that there is no study or observation that has been done on secondary entanglement for the marine renewable energy industry. So other studies we look into were modeling studies, and modeling studies mainly focus on the risk of encounter and the probability of entanglement. So they are made to predict this risk of encounter and this probability of entanglement. And the outputs of the model study are highly dependent on the behavior and the biological characteristics of the marine animals, such as, for example, the size. So, for example, here most of the models found that there was a higher risk of entanglement when the size of the animal was big, such as for whale. And also the outputs of the model are highly dependent on the mooring line or cable configuration and depth. So some studies that were looking into the risk of encounter between mooring line and whale found that there is a low risk of for entanglement for the whale and to be entangled in the mooring line. And another study looking into the risk of entanglement between the mooring tether and the marine mammals found that there is no risk of encountering the mooring tether while the device is operating. And even in the case of an encounter, the mooring lines will remain taut to avoid the risk of entanglement. So overall, from these studies, we know that if we have a single MRE device, the probability of encounter is likely to be low. However, as I mentioned, we have remaining uncertainties on a secondary interaction, such as the fishing gears that may be caught in a device. The biggest remaining concern here is around large arrays, and mainly because we don't have we have few marine renewable energy arrays in the water. This concern of entanglement is not really known and not really studied. But regarding array, we can look at the entanglement concern in a surrogate industry. So there is a recent study by Copping and Greer in 2018 that looked into the entanglement concern of whale in offshore floating wind farm. And here, Marco, please, if we can show the video, the first one.
Absolutely. One moment.
Thank you. So the author made a video showing a humpback whale and a calf swimming through an offshore floating wind farm array. So this is, I'm not showing the entire video, this is just a clip here. And the first one is just to give you some context. So here, yeah. So just to give you the context of the video, we have the beginning of the video here with the whale swimming towards the offshore floating wind farm, and we can see we have these two wind farms here. So can I exit and go back to my slide? Thank you. So here, this one here is the second video, and so if we can you please play this video? Thank you. So this next video shows the whale underwater, and this whale is swimming in between the mooring lines. So we see the mooring lines. We're going to see the mooring lines that connects the floating wind farm to the bottom. And also, this video does not give the probability of encounter, does not give the probability of entanglement. It provides perspective on the relative spatial scale of the devices and associated mooring components, the water depth, and the size of the marine animals. As we could see in the end of the video, the size of the marine animal was relatively small compared to the wind farm. Can I go back on my slide, please? So this can give us a relative idea of what would be the relative risk of encounter between a whale and mooring line in the water. So my last slide, and this is like the end of the chapter, is about recommendation. So from all the study we reviewed, we can propose several recommendations to resolve the entanglement concern of marine animal in marine renewable energy device mooring system, such as we recommend a better parameterization of the model and validation with field data. There is also a need of better characterizing the species behavior, such as diving, swimming, the color detection, as well as better characterization of their habitat for project siting. There is also a need to monitor the mooring system to detect an eventual malfunction or the presence of marine debris around the device, and this will resolve the concern of around secondary entanglement. And finally, there is a need to focus future research around entanglement risk on marine renewable energy arrays, because for now we don't really know what the risk is. Thank you very much. With some references I've just presented you in the slide. Thank you. And if you have any questions, if you want to see the entire chapter, the link will be in the last slide.
Thanks so much, Lisel. If you want to pass me back the ball. I'm not seeing a specific question at this time, but I would like to encourage the audience, if you have questions for Lisel or for any of the speakers, if you'd like to post them now, we can spend a few minutes going through them. Let's see, do I have the ball? And once again, I would encourage you to go and look at the full State of the Science report, specifically these chapters, but also any of the others that are of interest to you. So I'll just give it a couple minutes if we have any questions. Okay, there's one question for Lisel. What is the likelihood that the secondary entanglement you mentioned with marine debris could cause a problem on the mooring lines of marine renewable energy devices?
I wouldn't think that it's a problem for the mooring line. I mean, as long as we can monitor, and I feel like for marine renewable energy industry, like the monitoring of the device is actually pretty constant, so I don't think it will be a problem for the mooring line itself. It may be a problem if it's caught like in a turbine underwater, but I feel like there will be a sensor that will detect that. I don't think it would be. I mean, Andrea, just if you can add something here, but I don't think it will be a problem for the mooring line itself.
Okay, thank you. Okay, here's a question for both Leneg and Jonathan. Has anybody looked at the energy extraction from tidal turbines and related that to changes in sedimentation patterns? So, John, do you want to start, and then maybe Leneg can pick that up on the habitat side?
Yeah, certainly. And maybe this is somewhat related to the previous question I got, but you know, you kind of have to have a certain environment that has a lot of soft sediments in order to see a lot of the deposition in scour. And so a lot of that has primarily been studied in northern Scotland, Pentland Firth, and Orkney Isles. And there are some studies that look at kind of the formation of sandbanks and how sandbanks will kind of move a little bit. Now, granted, you have to keep in mind that there's been very little deployment, so that would have enough of an impact to affect it. I believe there was a study around the Maygen deployment looking at sandbanks, but primarily using modeling. And so they, you know, I think at a high level there could be some slight movement of the sandbanks due to the tidal extraction, but you also have to keep in mind that these sandbanks are usually pretty mobile, just naturally. And so the question is that shifting that you're getting from the tidal extraction, is that of concern or not? And it's hard to say.
And we have a note that says that there have been models specifically run to look at hydrodynamics and sediment transport with tidal turbines, and that there are some tools that have been developed by Sandia National Laboratories to based on the DELT platform. So there have been some of these studies done. Again, they're modeling studies that haven't been validated, which is sort of part of the whole challenge. Leneg, do you want to say anything about sedimentation patterns and what you see might become issues perhaps around tidal turbines, especially at larger developments?
Yes, sure. So that's a good question. So far, I haven't seen any study looking specifically at that, at sedimentation, at tidal, on tidal turbines. There's been a couple looking at infauna or epifauna communities but not at the sedimentation patterns itself. So there might be some that I missed, but I'm not aware of any. It would be interesting to look at this question.
Great, thank you. Another question, what are the suggested boundaries around the devices for fishing efforts, especially with drift nets and dredge fishing industries? What are the anticipated reserve effects? So I guess, Lene, you should take that one initially, at least on the reserve effects, and then there's probably some interesting discussion around what boundaries those might need.
Yes, sure. So boundary-wise, I think it really depends on the developers themselves, on how much wiggle room they are willing to give around the devices and the cables, and so discussions with regulators about how much can be closed for fishing on the local fishing communities too. So regarding the anticipated reserve effect, so it really depends if the closure is 100% closure, so then we could see some recovery from the local population. In some areas, they still allow like recreational fishing with just a fishing pole that would not create too much risk to be tangled around cables or mooring lines. So it's really a case-by-case situation, I would think.
Great. And as far as boundaries for fisheries or other sort of activities, I think this very much comes down to what the regional or national jurisdiction requires. And that, I think, is still really to be determined in marine energy devices as we go to larger arrays. We know that there's some moves being made in offshore wind for exclusion zones, but that's really still to be determined. Okay, I'll give it another minute. Oh, wait, there was an earlier question that we skipped over. For Brian and Chris, I guess, does the IEC standard take into account potential receivers in terms of what frequency it addresses for measurements? For example, some marine mammals hear higher frequencies, or is it more focused on the source?
Brian,
I can
grab
take this
it.
unless...
All right,
okay, Chris, go for it.
Okay. The answer is that it's really the technical specification is written solely focused on sort of characterizing the device noise. However, the frequency limits that are placed on that are really driven by, the full breadth of potential biological receivers. So, it spans a very wide range of frequencies that does not capture the absolute limits in terms of frequency, down to infrasound all the way up to, say, harbor porpoise clicks. It does capture most of that range, so it is indeed driven by all of the different potential receivers. So I hope that suitable. Brian?
A follow-up question to that. Thank you, Chris and Brian. Is there room in the technical specifications or perhaps an accompanying specification that would be more focused on looking at it, shall we say, from the animal's point of view? Do you see that as being something that IEC might get into?
I would say, based on my discussions with the IEC, they've been reluctant to get too involved with the biological side of the equation for any of the environmental effects. And I think that's something that was made at a strategic level when IEC was planning how to set up the international standards. They're in a process of revisiting their strategic plan now, so if there was enough interest in trying to do that, I think they'd be open to it. But for now, they've really tried to keep their focus fully on the marine energy converter side of the equation.
Great, thank you.
Too, I think it's important to note that although we do not get into this, or the specification does not get into this, we do think that it does a good job of characterizing devices, or we hope it does, so that, informed individuals can sort of take the outputs and frame them from that perspective. And that was really important to us, I think, is we wrote the specification not to get into that, but to make sure that the outputs that followed the technical specification would be useful for those discussions.
And Andrew, I guess I would add on to that even though the IEC may not necessarily consider the biological side of this to be in its scope, at least under its current planning process, that's not to say that that wouldn't be extremely valuable. I think it's a question of what the convening group to develop some sort of consensus around looking at the biological effects of the sound, whether it's playback studies or how to make observations. There's certainly kind of a growing body of literature in that area, and those of us who have been involved in that have been discussing how to go about this in a way that the studies are comparable. So I think there is value in the standardization. It just may be a pathway different than IEC.
Great. Yeah, really makes sense. Thank you. So a parallel question here for Andrew. You mentioned that there are no standards or specifications for measuring EMF, and it's probably because we don't know enough about the topic yet. What would you anticipate might happen in future, and when might we have a specification?
Ooh, that's a question. I think it'd be very speculative to say when we might have something. It is about we don't know enough about the fields that are coming just from any cables. And there was a question before about there's bigger cables out there, so we need to understand the range of EMF that's produced by the different types of cables that are out there. I mean, predominantly we're just looking at single cables, and we tend to be focusing on the main export cables or the cable coming from the devices. So we need to get an understanding of just whether the model values that we get coming out are actually are representative of what's out there. And then in parallel, again, it parallels very closely, but probably a couple of decades behind the acoustic side of things, is that understanding the dose response to the context. So we know these fields are there. So, we need to characterize them to understand first the variability, and then understand the sort of range that we have, and then it's the context of the receiving animals, and we just don't have enough information on threshold. So I would say that we could wait for a long time, but what we could do with doing is having a standard way to measure it, to understand what's coming from the devices, which is going to be beneficial to the operators anyway, because they produce the power output. It'd be interesting for them to know how their cables are, what they're producing, because essentially it's wasted energy in effect, and use that to help us sort of set potential sort of ranges. And then if we know those ranges, sort of upper, lower, or typical ranges, depending on let's say the weather, because it will vary depending on the power produced, and then the interest in the ability of organisms to perceive magnetic field and perceive electric field is a question in its own right anyway. So we're just using them in parallel to try and supplement the information for cables, because fortunately it doesn't standardization, but I would say we could standardize the way we measure the actual field in terms of the type of magnet sources, the sensitivity, and the reporting of the actual intensity values for both electric and magnetic components. In a way, again, that the acoustics have spent time trying to define a particular way to express the intensity level and the frequency.
Great. Okay, well, we'll look forward to being able to do that over the next few years, right? Okay.
Hopefully, yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think with that, we're going to wrap up here. I would like to thank the audience who hung in with us, and please do go to thesis.pnnl.gov and look for the State of the Science report. There's also some short science summaries, 2-pagers, if you want to just get a quick refresher on any of these topics. And we hope that you will tune in to next week's June 22nd webinar on collision risk and environmental monitoring technologies for measuring it. With that, I'd like to very much thank all of our speakers. I think everyone did a great job and stayed on time. And so thank you until next week.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conference Enhance. You may now disconnect.